Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me as we discuss an important subject that I think will be of interest to many Christians. So, some time ago, I was asked a question, and I think many people have been asking very similar questions. And I'd like to share my thoughts on this. The question is COVID 19 or the coronavirus, as we've all come to know it, a judgment or retribution from God for the sins of mankind? Basically, is it the wrath of God being poured out on humanity for their sins? Perhaps an initial question to ask is, does God use natural disasters to punish humanity? The best place to start, as any good theology should, is the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about this? The Old Testament seems to imply that God uses nature to punish mankind, but we must remember that the Old Testament is often a narrative of corporate or collective justice, and nature is often portrayed as the harbinger of God's wrath. The Old Testament has many stories of God using natural disasters to or calamities to visit his judgment on or punishment on people. We have stories of Noah and the great flood, the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by what seemed like a meteor shower, the story of Moses and the 10 plagues visited on Egypt, Israel experiencing severe drought conditions that led to starvation and death, and many other such accounts. So it does seem like God uses natural disasters in the past, or has used natural disasters in the past to bring humanity in line with his expectations of them. But before we conclude that the COVID 19 pandemic is indeed a judgment from God, let's look more closely at these stories and the manner in which these judgments were executed. I find there is a definite pattern that emerges when you examine God's retributive actions in the Old Testament. So, the first thing is God always issues a warning to mankind before he executes any form of judgment. He chooses a spokesperson and uses him or her to warn people of impending judgment if they don't listen. For those who consider God a sadistic tyrant who looks for every opportunity to judge and punish people, consider this. Why would he first warn them? A warning indicates a desire to give the recipient of that potential judgment an opportunity to change the outcome. This, for me, indicates a loving God and a merciful God who doesn't enjoy punishing people. A good parallel of this, I think, would be our own homes. We raise and educate our children so that they would comply with our expectations and be obedient to us. If they disobey or do things contrary to our expectations, we often warn them and explain that their behavior will result in consequences they will not enjoy. If the behavior persists, we mete out punishment that is befitting the situation. It is widely accepted that kind and loving parents dispense retribution as an act of love and correction in the best interests of their children. The same is true of God. Secondly, God always provides a reason for his judgment. People are made aware of their actions that they have led to the need for punishment. This is an attempt by God, I believe, to both instruct mankind in the path of justice and righteousness, and also to remind them of the fact that disobedience comes with consequences. The third thing we find is that God always provides an escape plan. In all the scenarios of corporate or collective justice found in the Old Testament, God always offers delinquent communities the opportunity or the option to choose life rather than death or punishment. In fact, in the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah, God agrees to spare the cities from his wrath if he finds just 10 people that were righteous in the city. This speaks of a forgiving God who will go out of his way to save mankind from disaster. So it's quite obvious from the text of the Old Testament that God does not use natural disasters to arbitrarily punish or hurt people. This kind of punishment is only reserved for the most disobedient and delinquent of people or communities. Also, the New Testament does not portray much in the way of corporate or collective judgment like the Old Testament does, primarily because Christ ushers in the grace dispensation through his vicarious atonement on the cross. We see more of the loving and forgiving nature of God, primarily because of the veil of grace that overshadows history because of Jesus Christ. The texts that do address collective retribution are mainly eschatological in nature, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. Another primary reason why I don't believe that natural disasters around us are a punishment by God against the sins of humanity is the fact that in many of these natural disasters, be they earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, viral outbreaks, or tsunamis, innocent people often lose their lives. Now we know from the Bible, and if you look at passages like Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, Jeremiah 32, verses 17 to 18, that God does not punish the innocent with or because of the wicked. It's a logical conclusion then that natural disasters cannot be the act of God bearing judgment upon people. In fact, when Abraham was pleading for mercy for Sodom and Gomorrah, he appeals to God's just nature by declaring, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" And we find that in Genesis chapter 18, verse 25. Justice is an attribute of God that will not allow himself to punish the innocent for the wrongs of the wicked. Therefore, to insinuate that natural disasters are a punishment from God goes against the very nature of God and his interaction with his people. So if God is not instigating natural disasters as punishment, is there another possible reason why we see so much destruction and loss of life from natural disasters in our world? Some may see this as a pointless and irrelevant question. After all, natural disasters are part of the natural world. So why must we look for reasons behind their existence or occurrence? Perhaps from a purely naturalistic perspective, this may sound reasonable. But I believe man and nature are more intricately linked than the naturalist would like to believe. The Bible teaches us that the morality of man affects natural processes around us. Consider the way nature was affected when Adam and Eve fell from grace. Or fell from their perfect position in Eden. The 6 trumpets of Revelations 8 and 9 show us that nature rebels against the sinfulness of mankind. There can be no doubt, even in today's world, that the excesses and the greed of our modern society and large corporations are affecting the way nature functions. Nature is a finely balanced ecosystem made up of all the different aspects of reality and space-time, and every action, whether positive or negative or good or bad, every action, every choice, every decision sends out ripples in the fabric of our reality that affects this fine balance either positively or negatively. The increase in natural disasters and the intensity with which they occur tells me that nature is attempting to self-correct in order to maintain the delicate balance that God created within it. So ultimately, we are to blame for the reactions that nature has to human interference in its very delicate balance. It's not just a matter of pollution and environmental negligence, it's deeper and bigger than that. Our moral choices don't just have physical consequences, they affect our entire ecosystem on a much deeper spiritual level. It is important for every person to realize that this is not about pointing fingers at those who are perpetrators of environmental degradation or moral decay and laying blame solely at their feet. I am equally responsible for the moral and environmental decay that causes nature to rebel against mankind. Every bad choice I make is a spark igniting the torch that burns a hole in the moral fabric of our universe. Every time I switch on the kettle to make a cup of tea, I add to the degradation of our planet's resources. I realize that just by using technology to present this talk, I have contributed to global warming. Taking responsibility, however, doesn't mean I have to regress to the dark ages in order to preserve our natural balance. It means that I have to make a concerted effort to contribute to the resources on our planet instead of just using them up. I have to contribute to the spiritual healing of the land by pointing my moral compass in the right direction. The Bible is clear. Man's moral decay leads to a deterioration of our natural resources and a rebellion against mankind by nature itself. And if you read passages like Leviticus 18:28, you'll find God speaking about the land spewing out the people because of their choice to be sinful. So why do the innocent suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? Jesus was asked this question in Luke chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. He addresses 2 instances in which innocent people were killed by forces outside of their control. The first was when Pilate's soldiers murdered Galileans in the temple. And the second was an incident that occurred in Siloam, in which 18 people were killed when a tower fell on them. Jesus makes it clear that these incidences don't in any way imply that these deaths were a punishment for these people's sins. He rather gets people to focus on their own need for moral rejuvenation so that they can escape spiritual death. Jesus is basically saying, rather than focusing on why people have to physically suffer, focus on what is needed to spiritually prosper. Suffering is a part of the human condition, and with or without God in the picture, suffering is a journey every person takes in one form or another. Keeping our eyes on the destination, that's eternal life in a perfect world, and having a mature spiritual development makes suffering in this world easier to bear. Okay. I want to speak for a minute to the God blamers of the world. Maybe you're someone, or maybe you know someone who blames God for the suffering in the world around us. We ask questions like, if God is so loving and kind, why does he allow innocent people to suffer? Or if God is so powerful and all-knowing, why doesn't he rescue people from these disasters or calamities? Perhaps it is that we need someone to blame for the suffering and the hurt that we see around us. And it's easier to blame some unseen being who cannot take umbrage or offense at our accusations, rather than for us to take any form of individual or collective responsibility for the suffering ourselves. After all, it's not God who commits murders and rapes and other atrocities that we see in the world. It's us. I am such a perpetrator of hurt as the next person is. The 3-year-old that was raped and murdered in one of our townships was not accosted by God. No, it's us that create the monsters that do this to others. Look at the condition of society of our homes. Look at the way we manage our resources and the way we respond to the deterioration of our social spaces, our social and our spiritual spaces. We create the catastrophes, and we look to blame God for them because we are too weak to take responsibility as a nation, as a species, for our own role in all of this destruction. Perhaps we've used the word God so many times and in such varied contexts that it has become maybe too familiar to most of us. God has been reduced to one of our friends, to just another someone. It doesn't inspire any awe in us anymore, and we can dare to make statements like, why does God think he can dictate how I should live my life, or the kind of choices I should make? Whether we do this consciously or subconsciously, or by our spiritual attitudes, many of us have this kind of thinking. Why does God think he can dictate to me? I would like to remind you today that despite the fact that God is loving and kind, he is the creator of all the cosmos around us. By his single word, he created the intricate laws of quantum mechanics. And by just a thought, he fashioned the complexities of the entire created reality of space and time as we know it. Nothing that we can do or accomplish will ever give us the stature to question the motives or the authenticity of the creator of all the universe. Let me remind you gently that no amount of ranting against God changes the way the world turns. So instead of expending all of that energy trying to reduce God to the level of man, why don't we use that energy to bring our bodies, minds, and environments into harmony with the laws of nature, so that we bring peace to the world we live in? We are the key to our world's happiness. Our actions affect everything around us. So to sum up tonight, I don't believe that COVID-19 is in any way a punishment from God for the sins of mankind. Jesus paid for the sins of the world once and for all on the cross. But it is a natural disaster, and we all have to consider the roles that we play in causing nature to rebel against humanity. How can we improve our lifestyles and make better moral and ethical choices? How can we protect our environment and contribute to resources rather than destroying them? Remember, your choices affect the balance of nature. Let's take responsibility for our actions, big or small. Stay blessed, and I hope that this has inspired you to be a better person for a better world.